Kushiel'sDart, Chapter 12. I have never known Delaunay to fuss over his appearance, though he always looked the height of elegance. But the day of the triumph, he stewed over his attire like an adept with a prospective lover, settling at length upon a doublet and hosen of sober black velvet against which his braided hair lay like a twist of auburn flame. "Why is it so important, my lord?" I asked, adjusting the pomander that hung from his belt. Delaunay had his own valet, of course, but on special occasions he allowed me to oversee the details. One did not grow up in Sirius House without acquiring a keen eye and nimble fingers for such niceties.
"For Cecily, of course."
He gave me his broad grin, always unexpected and thrilling.
"She's not held a gathering such as this since before Antoine died. I've no wish to embarrass her."
He had loved her, then. I'd suspected it had been so in the old days. Delaunay had had mistresses aplenty in the 5 years I'd been in his household. That was nothing new. Many a time I had heard them after the other guests had gone. Delaunay's low voice, and the thrill of a woman's laughter. I felt no threat from them. In the end, they left, while I stayed. Alcuin was another matter, of course, but this touched me, in truth, his devotion to a mistress who had long ago been one of the brightest blossoms in the court of night-blooming flowers. My eyes pricked with moisture, and I inhaled of the pomander with its sweet sharp scent of beeswax and cloves to hide it, pressing my cheek to his velveted knee.
"Phèdre."
Delaunay's hands drew me to my feet, and I blinked up at him.
"You will be a credit to my house as ever, but remember this is Alcuin's debut, and be gracious."
He broke out his infectious smile.
"Come, then, shall we summon him for inspection?"
"Yes, my lord," I murmured, doing my best to sound gracious. I would have guessed, if asked, that Delaunay would have attired Alcuin like a prince. I would have been wrong. It was ever easy to underrate his subtlety. We were gathering to watch a royal triumph. Cecily's guests would see nobles by the score, decked out in their finest trumpery. If Alcuin looked anything close to royalty, it was as the king's stable boy. So I thought, at first glance. Upon second glance, I saw that his white shirt was not canvas, but cambric, the linen spun so fine one could barely see the weave, and what I had taken for buckram hose were breeches of moleskin. His knee-high boots were black leather, shined until they gave back reflections. His remarkable hair simply hung loose, brushed into a shining river of ivory. It spilled over his shoulders and down his back, accenting a face that had emerged from adolescence with all its grave, shy beauty intact, from which Alcuin viewed the world out of dark and solemn eyes. Delaunay was a genius. Somehow, the rustic garb, or elegant replication of it, served to point up all the more Alcuin's otherworldly charm.
"Very nice,"
Delaunay said. I heard the satisfaction, and maybe something else in his voice. Be gracious, I thought to myself. After all, he is allowing you to attend. You look beautiful, I told Alcuin sincerely. He did. So do you. He grasped my hand, smiling, not a trace of envy in him. "Oh, Phèdre." I drew back a little, returning his smile with a shake of my head. "It is your night tonight, Alcuin. Mine will come."
"Soon, or you'll drive us to distraction,"
Delaunay said humorously.
"Come then, the coach is waiting."
The house of Cecily la Veuve Perrine was larger than Delaunay's and closer to the palace. We were met at the door by a liveried footman who escorted us up a broad, winding staircase. The whole of the 3rd story was designed for entertaining, an open plan with high ceilings, containing a long table set with silver and white linen, a parlor that combined comfort and elegance, giving way to the parquet floor of the ballroom. Arched doors opened from the dance floor onto the balcony, which overlooked the route of the Triumph. A quartet played a stately air on a dais in the corner, largely ignored. Despite the chill, for it was still winter, those guests who had already arrived were clustered on the balcony. "Anafiel!" With the unerring instincts that had given renown to her hospitality, Cecily marked the precise moment of our arrival and swept through the doors to greet us. "How good to see you!" For all the hours that I had spent under her tutelage, it was only then that I discerned the magnitude of her allure. Not all the adepts of the night court weather the passing of youth with grace. Cecily had succeeded. If her golden hair was dimmed with gray, it but made more youthful hues seem garish, and the fine lines around her eyes were the marks of care and wisdom. "You are a vision," Delaunay said fondly. She laughed, free and charming. "You still lie like a poet, Anafiel. Come, Alcuin, let me see you." With a critical eye, she adjusted his collar, letting it fall open to reveal the tender hollow at the base of his throat. "There," she patted his cheek. "The Triumph has just left the palace. There's time yet to meet my guests. You know you've only to say if you've no wish to go through with this." "I know." Alcuin gave her his most serene smile. "Good, then. You need only whisper it to me or shake your head." She turned to me. "Phèdre." With a shake of her own head, she set her diamond earrings to trembling, scintillating in the light. "Beware of setting brush fires, my dear." I murmured some acquiescence, thinking it an odd comment, but fully half my attention was already on the balcony, where in moments I would meet at last the men and women who might soon number among my own patrons. I might not shine as Alcuin did this day. Delaunay had chosen for my attire an exceedingly simple gown of dark brown velvet, the caul of silk mesh that held my abundant locks in restraint. But I had no mind to be overlooked either. Our entrance created a small stir. The guests were hand-picked by Cecily, who moved in circles that overlapped but did not overlay Delaunay's. Some of them, such as Gaspard Trevelyan, Comte de Fourquet, were friends of his. Others were not. I watched their faces when we were announced and saw who smiled, whose gazes slid away to make contact with others, communicating silently. These were the ones, ultimately, to be sought. Anyone with sufficient coin would pay the contract fee and put money towards my mark, but money was never what Delaunay sought. We were an investment of a different kind. It was not long before I saw why Delaunay had allowed me to come. Alcuin moved among the scions of Alua like a stable-boy prince, drawing stares, and where he went, I heard the whisper of rumor follow. Servant of Nama, and eve of his birthday. Delaunay and Cecily had something planned, of that I had no doubt, nor did the guests. But while Delaunay mingled, conversing smoothly, and Alcuin found himself at the center of attention, covert and overt alike, I was able to remain quiet on the fringes, watching and listening. Anafiel Delaunay sets his traps with an interesting bait. The amused comment of a tall man with dark hair and a tight braid in the hooded eyes of a bird of prey caught my ear. Lord Childeric de Essoms, I remembered, of the court of Chancery. He spoke to a slight man in a dark blue, whose name I had not heard. "You are intrigued?" His companion raised his eyebrows. De Essoms laughed, shaking his sleek head. "My taste is for spies and not sweets, but it is interesting to note, no?" Yes, I thought, filing the comment away in my memory, as Delaunay had taught me. It is interesting to note your interest, my lord, and your tastes as well." The two men parted, and I followed the smaller, straining to overhear as a tall woman with an elaborate headdress greeted him by name. But just then the trumpets sounded, and someone cried out that the triumph was approaching. Everyone crowded to the edge of the balcony. I had lost sight of Delaunay and Cecily, and was trapped behind the press of bodies. For a moment it seemed that my view of the royal triumph would consist of the brocaded and silk-swathed backsides of Cecily's guests. Then a portly gentleman with a grey beard and a gentle smile took note and made room for me at the parapet. Thanking him, I gripped the stone and leaned over to see. Every terrace along the route was crowded with people, and there were crowds lining the street. The triumph approached at a distance, shining under the weak winter sun, announced by the brazen call of trumpets. A detachment of the palace guard rode ahead, pressing the spectators back against the buildings. Behind them came the standard-bearer, riding alone. We were near enough that I could make out faces, and his was young, stern, and handsome. He gripped the haft firmly, and the standard snapped in the air below us. A golden lily on a field of rich green, surrounded by 7 golden stars, the sign of Blessed Alua and his companions, the emblem of Terre d'Ange. After the standard-bearer came another row of guards, and then Anafiel Delaunay, scion of Alua, king of Terre d'Ange. I had known the king was elderly, but still it surprised me to see it. Though his carriage in the saddle was straight and tall, his hair and beard were almost completely white, and his fierce eyes were set in hollows, particularly overhung by grizzled white brows. At his side rode Ysandre de la Courcelle, his granddaughter, Dauphine, and heir to the throne of Terre d'Ange. If this were an allegory play, they might have represented the old winter and new spring, for Ysandre de la Courcelle was as fresh and beautiful as the first day of spring. She rode side-saddle on her dappled courser, clad in a gown the color of the first shoots of the crocus to poke through the cold earth, with a cloak of royal purple over it. A simple gold fillet bound her flowing hair, which was the palest of blonde, and her face was youthful and fair. On the street, the Angelines hailed her with affectionate cries, but on the balcony I detected a murmurous undertone. Ysandre de la Courcelle was young, beloved and beautiful, heir to a kingdom, and notably unwed, neither betrothed nor promised. Though her face betrayed nothing, she had to be aware of the undertone, I thought, watching from above. Surely it must follow her everywhere she went. The emblem of de la Courcelle, the house royal, flew beside them, lower than the flag of Terre d'Ange, but preceding all the others, as was custom. A silver swan on a field of midnight blue, the small party gathered beneath it, made it look somehow forlorn. Anafiel de la Courcelle's line ended with Ysandre. His only son was dead, and his only brother, Prince Benedict, had wed into the ruling Cardici family in La Serenissima to a woman who gave him only daughters. All these things, of course, I knew, yet somehow seeing it made it so. On that balcony, surrounded by murmurs, I watched the elderly king and the young Dauphine, no older than myself, and I felt around me the eddies of hunger centered on a precariously held throne. And behind the king rode his sister and her husband, the Princess Lionette, and her duke, Marc de Trevelyan. The Lioness of Azal looked indulgently pleased. The duke's face was unreadable. 3 ships and the navigator's star flew on their standard, and underneath those arms, too, rode their impetuous son. I could hear the chant rising up from the streets as they passed, "Badwin, Badwin." He was little changed from the young lord who had stolen the role of the Sun Prince 5 years past. A little older, perhaps, in the prime of his youth rather than entering the threshold, but the wild gleam in his sea-gray eyes was the same. A chosen cadre of glory-seekers, the personal guard to which he was entitled as a prince of the blood, surrounded him loosely. They took up the chant, too, shouting his name, raising their swords to catch the light. And at his side, composed and serene, rode Melisande Shahrazai, Badawin's delight, and the single thorn in the side of Lioness of Azal. Her raven hair fell in ripples, gleaming like black water in the moonlight, and her beauty made the young Dauphin who preceded them look pallid and unfinished. It was only the second time I had seen her, but even at a distance I shuddered.
"Well, that's clear enough,"
murmured the portly gentleman who had made room for me. His voice held a faint accent. I wanted to turn to look at his face, but I was pressed too tight against the stone parapet to do it with any subtlety. A lone rider followed the company of House Trevelyan, bearing the standard of the province of Kamlach, a blazing sword on a sable field. It had a sobering effect on the gathered crowds, reminding us all that the battle was the cause of the day. "If d'Anglemort had asked them to ride under his banner," a woman's voice said softly somewhere near me, "they would have acknowledged his right."
"Do you say he's politic enough to be dangerous?"
The man who answered her sounded amused.
"The scions of Camelot think with their swords." "Give thanks to blessed Alua that they do," someone else said sharply, "for I've no wish to become part of scaldy tribal holdings." The allies of Kamlach made an impressive array, and whatever rights he may have ceded, the young Duke d'Anglemort rolled square in their midst. I counted the banners. Putting faces to the names Delaunay had made me memorize. Ferrot, Montchapetre, Valliere, Balisque, all of the great holdings of Kamlach, hardened warriors, most of them lean and keen-eyed. Isidore d'Anglemort stood out among them, glittering like the silver eagle on his standard. His eyes were dark and merciless, and as his gaze swept over the crowds, I remembered where I had seen them. He had been the man in the Géragondy mask at the midwinter fête. He would be interesting to put to the test. Another woman mused languidly. "So would a mountain lion."
One of the men who had spoken before answered tartly.
"But I don't recommend taking one to bed."
I ignored the ensuing laughter, watching the allies of Kamlach pass. Even represented by a symbolic few, the bulk of their forces remained in Kamlach, securing the regained border. They made for a powerful assemblage. Azal and Kamlach bracketed the realm to the west and east. The popular acclaim accorded Badouin de Trevelyan, in combination with the might represented by the allies of Kamlach, sent a message that was, indeed, frightening in its lack of subtlety. After the Kamlach host came the train of spoils, loot seized in battle. Arms aplenty were displayed, and I shivered at the massive battle axes. The Scaldi are mighty poets, I know, having studied their tongue long enough, but their songs are all of blood and iron, and those whom they defeat they enslave. We d'Angelines are civilized. Even one sold into debt bondage, as I was, has the eventual hope of purchasing freedom. At length the baggage train, too, passed, and Cicely's guests began to move back into the house. I turned about to see the smiling face of the bearded man behind me. His features were distinctly un-d'Angeline. Recalling the trace of an accent, I marked him as Aragonian.
"You are of the household of Anafiel Delaunay, I think. Did you enjoy the parade?"
he asked me kindly. "Yes, my lord." I had no idea of his status, but the response was automatic. He laughed.
"I am Gonzago de Escobares, and no lord, but a sometime historian. Come, give me your name, and let us go inside together."
"Phèdre," I told him.
"Ah."
He clucked his tongue and held out his arm.
"An unlucky name, child. I will be your friend, then, for the ancient Hellenes said a good friend may stand between a man and his Moira. Do you know what that means?
Fate, I answered unthinking, for Delaunay had specified that neither Alcuin nor I were to betray the extent of our learning without his approval. But a connection had formed in my mind, the linkage surfacing. You were one of his teachers at the university in Tiberium.
Indeed.
He made me a courtly little bow with a click of his heels.
I have since retired, and travel at leisure to see the places of which I so have long forgotten. But I had the privilege of teaching your Delaunay and his maestro.
Delaunay's voice, ringing with unalloyed pleasure, interrupted us as we entered the ballroom. He crossed the floor in great strides, beaming, embracing the older man with great affection.
Sicily didn't tell me you would be here.
Gonzago de Escobares wheezed at his embrace, thumping Delaunay's back.
Ah, Anafiel, my boy, I am old and allow myself one luxury. Where the crux of history turns, I may be there to watch it grind. If it turns in terre d'ange, so much the better, where I may surround my aging form with such beauty.
He patted Delaunay on the cheek, smiling.
You have lost none of yours, young Antonius. You flatter me, maestro.
Delaunay took Escobares' hand in his, but there was a reserved quality to his smile.
I must remind you, though.
Ah. The Aragonian professor's expression changed, growing sharper and sadder.
Yes, of course, forgive me, but it is good to see you, Anafiel. Very good, it is.
Delaunay smiled again, meaning it.
May we speak later? There is someone I wish Phèdre to meet.
Of course, of course. He patted my shoulder with the same indulgent affection.
Go, child, and enjoy yourself. This is no time to waste on aging pedants.
Delaunay laughed and shook his head, leading me away. Silently I cursed his timing, but aloud I merely asked, He taught you at the university?
The Tiberians collect scholars the way they used to amass empires,
Delaunay said absently.
Maestro Gonzago was one of the best.
Yes, my lord, I thought, and he called you Anafiel and Antonius, which is a name from the title of a poem which is proscribed. But he stumbled once over the name Delaunay, which Hyacinth says is not truly yours. He might have told me a great deal more had you not intervened, so while I do as you say, be mindful that I do also as you have taught. But these things I kept silent, and followed obediently as he turned in a way that caused me to bump into a blonde woman with aquiline features, who turned about with a sharp exclamation.
Phèdre.
Delaunay's voice held a chastising note.
Solane, I am sorry. This is Phèdre's first such gathering. Phèdre, this is Marquis Solane, Belfort's, to whom you will apologize.
You might let the girl speak for herself, Delaunay. Her voice held irritation. Solane Belfort's had no great love for Delaunay, and I marked it well. Even as I cast an annoyed glance at him for placing me in this position, the collision was of his manufacturing. No child was trained in Sirius House without learning how to move gracefully and unobtrusively through a crowd.
The Marquise is a secretary of the Privy Seal,
Delaunay remarked casually, placing a hand on my shoulder, letting me know the import of her position. He wanted contrition from me, I knew. But while Delaunay may have known his targets and their weaknesses, he was not what I was. What I knew was born in the blood. Sorry, I muttered with ill grace, and glanced sullenly up at her, feeling the thrill of defiance deep in my bones. Her blue-green eyes grew cold, and her mouth hardened. Your charge needs a lesson, Delaunay. She turned away abruptly, stalking across the ballroom. I looked at Delaunay to see his brows arched with uncertainty and surprise. Beware of setting bushfires, Cicely had said. Her comment made more sense to me now, although I did not of a necessity agree with it. I shrugged Delaunay's hand off of my shoulder. Tend to Alcuin, my lord. I am well enough on my own.
Too well, perhaps.
He laughed ruefully and shook his head.
Stay out of trouble, Phèdre. I've enough to deal with this night.
Of course, my lord. I smiled impudently up at him. With another despairing shake of his head, he left me. Left to my own devices, I dare say I did well enough. Several of the guests had brought companions, and we made acquaintance. There was a slight, dark youth from Eglantine House, whose quick grin reminded me of Hyacinth. He did a tumbling dance alone with hoops and ribbons, and everyone applauded him. His patron, Lord Chavier's, smiled with pride. And there was Mirette from Orchis House, who had made her mark and kept her salon now. Steeped in gaiety for which her house was renowned, she brought laughter and a sense of sunlight with her, and where she went, I saw pleasure and merriment light people's faces. Many of them, though, eyed Alcuin, who moved through the gathering oblivious to it all, serene and dark-eyed, watching their faces, and marked that among them all one stood out. I knew him, for Vitale Bavard was an acquaintance of Delaunay's, not a friend, I think, but he had been a guest at Delaunay's house. He was a trader, of common stock indeed. It was rumored there was Cardici blood in his lineage, but an excessively wealthy one, by virtue of an exclusive charter with the Stragazza family in La Serenissima. His gaze followed Alcuin, and his face was sick with desire. When the last rays of sun had gone, and darkness filled the long windows around the balcony, Cicely clapped her hands and summoned us to dine. No fewer than 27 guests were arranged about the long table, ushered to our seats by solicitous servants clad in spotless white attire. Dishes came in an unceasing stream, soups and terrines followed by pigeon and daub, a rack of lamb, salads and greens, and a dish of white turnips whipped to a froth, which everyone pronounced a delight of rustic sophistication, and all the rivers of wine poured from chilled jugs into glasses only half empty. "A toast!" Cecily cried when the last dish, a dessert of winter apples baked in muscat wine and spiced with cloves, had been cleared. She lifted her glass and waited for silence. She had the gift, still, of commanding attention. The table fell quiet. "To the safety of our boarders," she said, letting the words fall in a soft voice. "To the safety and well-being of blessed Terre d'Ange." A murmurous accord sounded the length of the table. This was one point on which each of us agreed. I drank with a willing heart, and saw no one who did not do the same. "Thelysis," Cecily said in the same soft voice. Near the end of the table a woman rose. She was small and dark, and not, I thought, a great beauty. Her features were unremarkable, and her best asset, a luminous dark eyes, were offset by a low brow. And then she spoke. There are many kinds of beauty. We are d'Angeline. "Beneath the golden balm," she said aloud, simply, and her voice filled every corner of the room, imbued with golden light. "Settling on the fields, evening steals in calm, and farmers count their yields." So simple her lyric, and yet I saw it all. She offered up the words unadorned, plain and lovely. "The bee is in the lavender, the honey fills the comb," and then her voice changed to something still and lonely. "But here a rain falls, never ending, and I am far from home." Everyone knows the words to the exile's lament. It was written by Thelysis de Mornay when she was 23 years old and living in exile on the rain-swept coast of Alba. I myself had heard it 12 times over, and recited it more than one tutor's behest. Still, hearing it now, tears filled my eyes. We were to Angeline, bred and bound to this land which blessed Alua loved so well he shed his blood for it. In the silence that followed, Félicie de Mornay took her seat. Cicely kept her glass raised. "My lords and ladies," she said in her gentle voice, marked by the cadences of serious house, "let it never be forgotten what we are." With a solemn air she lifted her glass and tipped it, spilling a libation. "Alua have mercy on us." Her solemnity caught us all, and many followed suit. I did, and saw Delaunay and Alcuin did as well. Then Cecily looked up again with a mischievous light in her eyes. "And now," she declared, "let the games begin. Katabos!" Amid shouts of laughter we retired to the parlor, united by the love of our country and Cecily's conviviality. Her servants had prudently removed the carpet, and in its place was a silver floor stand. Standing on tripodal legs, it pierced a held and brocaded silver crater, polished to mirrored brightness. Chaste figures around the rim depicted in a d'Angeline drinking party à la Hélène. The d'Angelines regarded the golden era of Hellas as the last great civilization before the coming of Alua, which is why such things never go out of style. Spiring out of the center of the crater, the stand rose to some 4 feet and terminated. Balanced atop its finial was the silver disc of the plastings. Cecily's servants circulated with wine jugs and fresh cups, shallow silver wine bowls with ornate handles. To get to the lees, of course, one must drink what is poured, and although I had been prudent in my drinking, I felt it warm my blood as I emptied my cup. It is an art which must be practiced, twirling the handle about one's finger, flinging the last drops of wine in such a way that they strike the plastings, knocking it into the crater so that it sounds like a cymbal. When I took my turn, 5 or 6 others had gone before me, and while some had hit the plastings, none had knocked it off the shaft. I did not even do as well as that, but Félicie de Mornay smiled kindly at me. Cicely succeeded to much applause, but the plastings rattled against the edge before dropping into the bowl of the crater. Lord Childeric de Essoms spun his cup so fast that the dregs of his wine flew like a bolt from the crossbow, knocking the plastings clear off the shaft and onto the floor. Everyone cheered and laughed, though it didn't count. Mireille of Orchis House rang the bowl, and Gaspar, Comte de Fourquet, and to everyone's surprise, Gonzago de Escobarez, who smiled into his beard. Alcuin, who had shared a couch with a tall woman in a headdress, fared worse than I, and only spattered wine about. His companion raised his fingers to her lips and sucked droplets of wine from them. Alcuin blushed. Vital Bouvard was sufficiently unsettled that he let go the handle of his cup and threw it with his wine. The plastings dropped into the basin, but it was not counted as a legal shot. When Delaunay took his turn, and somehow it fell out that he went last, he looked calm and collected, austere in his black velvet attire. Reclining on one of the couches and leaning on one arm, he spun the cup and let fly his lees with an elegant motion. His aim was unerring, and the silver plastings toppled neatly into the basin, which rang like a chime. Not everyone applauded, I noted, but those who did so loudly, proclaiming him the victor. "A forfeit! A forfeit!" Mariette cried, flushed and gorgeous on her couch. "Messire Delaunay claims a forfeit from the hostess." Cecily acknowledged it, laughing. "What will you have, Anafiel?" she asked teasingly. Delaunay smiled and went over to her. Bending down, he claimed a kiss. A sweet one, I thought, and whispered in her ear. Cecily laughed again, and Delaunay went back to his couch. I am minded to grant this claim, Cecily said archly. At the stroke of midnight, Alcuin no Delaunay, who is dedicated to Nama, will gain 16 years of age. The holder of his mark asks that we hold an auction for his virgin price. Is anyone here minded to object? You may be sure that no one objected, and, as if on cue, indeed, I am sure they planned it, Delaunay and Cecily. The distant voice of a horologist crying midnight in the square filtered through the balcony windows into the waiting silence. Cecily raised her glass. Let it be so. I declare the bidding open. In one smooth, graceful motion, Alcuin rose from his couch and stood before us, holding his hands out open and turning slowly. I have seen 100 adepts of the first of the 13 houses on display, and I have never seen anyone who matched his dignity in it. Childeric de Essoms, who claimed no interest in Delaunay's bait, was the first to bid. 200 ducats, he shouted. Because I had been watching him that night, I saw the hunter's gleam in his eye, and knew that, for him, this was not about desire. You insult the boy, Alcuin's couchmate declared. I recollected her name, which was Madame Dufresne. 250. Vital Bouvard looked apoplectic. 300, he offered in a strangled voice. Alcuin smiled in his direction. 350, Solane Belfort said evenly. Oh my! Myriette of Orchis House drained her cup and set it down delicately. Toying with the golden cascade of her hair, she looked merrily at Cecily. Cecily, you are too bad. How often does such a chance come to one such as us? I will bid 4, and the boy will thank me for it. 450, Vital reported angrily. Someone else bid higher. I cannot remember who, for it was at this point that matters escalated. For some of the bidders, like Childeric de Essoms, it was merely a game, and I think he at least took the most pleasure in seeing the despair of others as the chase grew heated. For others, I was not so sure. Myriette de Orchis bid higher than I would have guessed, and I never knew if it was desire that spurred her or complicity with Cecily's design. But for the rest there was no question. It was Alcuin they desired. Serene and beautiful, and like no one else in the world, with his white hair falling like a curtain over his shoulders, and his dark, secret eyes. Through it all, Delaunay never moved, nor gave anything away. When the bidding passed 1,000 ducats, he glanced once at Cecily, and she beckoned for her chancellor, who came forward with a contract and a pen at the ready. In the end, it came down to Vital Bouvard, Madame Dufresne, and another man, the Chevalier Gideon Landres, who had holdings in Lagnas and was a member of Parliament. We, who had seen how matters would fall out, watched and waited. 6,000 ducats! Vital Bouvard threw down the offer as if it were a gauntlet. His face was red. Madame Dufresne touched her fingers to her lips, counted silently to herself, and shook her head. The Chevalier merely crossed his arms and looked impassive. So it was done, and Alcuin's virgin price fetched 6,000 ducats. I, who had grown up in the night court, had never heard of such a thing, though, oddly enough, it was not that of which I thought in that moment, but Hyacinth's mother, who wore her wealth upon her person and might never hope to carry so much as Alcuin fetched in a single night. When the matter was concluded, Cecily's chancellor drew up the contract swiftly, though I don't believe Vital even glanced at what he was signing. The night was young still, but he would have no more of this gathering. Come, he said to Alcuin, his voice thick. My carriage is waiting. He glanced once at Delaunay.
My driver will bring him on the morrow. Is that acceptable?
Delaunay, who had spoken little, inclined his head. Alcuin looked at him but once, a grave, solemn look. Delaunay returned it, unflinching. Vitale reached out his hand, and Alcuin took it. I recall that upon their leaving, Cecily clapped her hands together, and the musicians struck up a merry tune, though, in truth, my memory may be somewhat blurred by the wine. There was dancing, and I danced with Gonzago de Escobares and the Chevalier Landres, stoic at his loss, and once with Lord Childeric de Essoms, who smiled and looked at me as the hawk eyes the sparrow. And then Lord Gervais called for a stamping rhythm with timbales and finger drums, and I danced with his lover from Eglantine House, the agile youth who had tumbled for us, and I kept the rhythm and was grateful for the lessons Delaunay had foisted upon me. Late in the night, I remember, Delaunay brought Félicie de la Mornay to be introduced, and she touched my face lightly with her slim, dark fingers, and declaimed the lines about Kushiel'sDart from the Lecourneux text, and there was a little silence then, murmuring. So everyone knew, then, what the scarlet mote in my eye betokened, and I would have gone with any one of them, were it not for Delaunay's grip at my elbow, reminding me like an anchor where my duty lay. Thanks so much for tuning in today at The Reading Nook. Please tune in soon for next chapter, and make sure you like, share, subscribe, and comment. I look forward to seeing you again soon.